I was still wearing my apron when my husband told me to apologize or get out. Not, we need to talk. Not, let's step outside. He said it in front of his entire family at a table covered in cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. Like I was a child who had knocked over a glass of milk. None of them knew that I had been preparing for this moment for months. None of them knew that I had been silent and listening, document every lie, every deception. And when he issued that ultimatum, I had it all. Evidence. And escape. So I stood up, I smoothed my dress, and I said the word he wanted to hear. Okay. What he didn't know was that okay wasn't surrender. It was a countdown. By midnight, I had 2 suitcases packed, my son asleep in my arms, and 2 one-way tickets to a country he couldn't even find on a map by morning. His family's phones wouldn't stop ringing because I had already sent the one thing they spent 6 years trying to bury. This the story of how a bowl of stuffing to marriage and how silence, once broken, doesn't just whisper. It screams. My name is Everly. 3 years ago, I thought I had built a good life. I was 3-1, working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Columbus. My job was to look at numbers, find patterns, detect anomalies. I could spot a misappropriated expense from a corporate budget spreadsheet in minutes. I could look at an investment portfolio and know exactly where money was leaking, but I hadn't looked at my own marriage with that same clarity. That's the irony I still can't quite let go of. I was married to a man named Sawyer who used to make me laugh so hard I'd forget what we were even arguing about. That was one of the first things I loved about him. He had a sharp sense of humor, and he had a way of making the worst days feel bearable. When we were dating, he once drove me to an empty parking lot and danced to a song playing from his phone, not caring who was watching. Just wanting to make me smile. I loved him for that. I loved him because he wasn't like the other men I'd known. We had a son, Finn, who was 3 years old and obsessed with dump trucks and dinosaurs in a way that made every grocery store trip take twice as long. Finn was the kind of kid whose smile was so wide it seemed to take up his whole face. He'd point at a truck on the road and yell, "Dump truck!" with such enthusiasm that even I would look over. When he hugged his stuffed T-Rex and fell asleep, the world seemed to make sense again. He was the only bright spot a marriage I was slowly reeling had become a dark place. On paper, everything looked stable. I made good money. Sawyer worked in sales, commission-based, which meant some months were flush and some months were tight. I didn't mind the unevenness. What I minded was the silence that came with it. The way Sawyer would change the subject whenever I asked about our savings account. The way he'd laugh off questions about a new watch or new set of golf clubs he got a deal on. He had a talent for making everything sound harmless. It was steal, honey. A client was selling it for cheap. A surprise bonus from last quarter. I forgot about it. I told myself it was nothing. Every marriage has its blind spots. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact shape of my own denial. I was the one who balanced our budget every month, who set up the automatic transfers into savings, who tracked our expenses in a spreadsheet color-coded by category. That was my pride, my control. I thought if I managed the numbers carefully enough, everything would be okay. I didn't realize that while I was tracking every penny in and out of our joint account, Sawyer was running a completely parallel financial system outside my view when numbers came up short. Sawyer always had an explanation ready before I even finished asking the question. A client dinner that ran long, a slow commission month. A "we'll make it up next quarter" that never quite arrived. He said it with the confidence of a man who had practiced his lies so many times he almost believed them himself. I want to believe him, so I did. That's the part I still have trouble forgiving myself for. Not the years I spent married to him, but the years I spent choosing comfort over asking the harder question twice. The real problem wasn't Sawyer, though. Not at first. It was his mother. Eleanor had never wanted me in the family. I found that out 3 weeks into dating Sawyer when she looked me up and down at a family barbecue and said, "So, you're the one keeping him from finishing his degree." I hadn't even known he dropped out of college. She made sure I found out in front of 20 people. I can still remember that moment exactly. The heat of the grill, the smell of barbecue. And the way she smiled when she said it, like she had just won a game I didn't know I was playing. Sawyer said nothing. He just stared at his plate and tore off a piece of bread. That was the first time I saw him so that, but it wouldn't be the last. From that day forward, everything I did was wrong. If I worked late, I was neglecting my family. If I stayed home, I was lazy and living off her son. If I disciplined Finn, I was too harsh. If I let him have dessert before dinner, I was too soft. There was no version of me that Eleanor would have accepted because the only acceptable version of me didn't exist. She was a woman who didn't exist, who deferred to Sawyer in everything and asked for nothing in return. A woman who would give up her career, give up her independence, give up any part of hers to become a silent shadow in their family. Sawyer never defended me, not once. He'd go quiet at family dinners, staring at his plate while his mother picked me apart, and afterward in the car he'd say, "That's just how she is. Don't let it get to you." Those words became the mantra of our marriage. Every time Eleanor hurt me, Sawyer would say those words, as if they had some magical power to heal wounds. But they never did. They only made me feel that my pain didn't matter as much as his peace. What made it worse was how select Eleanor's disapproval could be. She adored Isla, Cassius's wife, who quit her job the year she got married and never worked outside the home again. Eleanor bragged about Isla to anyone who'd listen. How devoted she was, how she never put hers first. Isla was the woman Eleanor wanted me to be, and she was also the woman I resented most. Not because of her choices, but because of how she used them as a weapon against me, when I was struggling to balance a career and a toddler. Isla would comment on how stressed I looked with a pitying smile. When I mentioned a work project I was psyched about, she'd ask, "We're still doing that?" with a tone that suggested my job was a temporary hobby. I used to wonder if Eleanor genuinely believed the things she said about family, or if she simply needed a version of womanhood she could hold up as proof that her own choices had been the right ones. She had sacrificed her career for her husband and family. She had raised children she believed to be exemplary. I could succeed without making that sacrifice. It would call into question her own sacrifices. I think that's why she hated me. Not because of who I was, but because of what I represented. An alternative, either way, I became the family's convenient contrast. A cautionary tale nobody asked to star in. I let it get to me for 3 years. Every Thanksgiving, we drove 2 hours to his parents' house in a quiet Ohio suburb, a place with a manicured lawn, a dining room with a chandelier too large for the space, and a display case in the hallway that held his father Roscoe's collection of antique hunting blades, polished and mounted like trophies nobody was allowed to touch. I always found that display case unsettling. Sharp knives, displayed at the eye level of a toddler, and no one said a word. When I mentioned it to Sawyer once, he said, "It's Dad's collection. Don't make a thing of it." And I didn't, like everything else. Every Thanksgiving, I told myself this year would be different. Every Thanksgiving. I was wrong. I would wear my nicest dress, bring my best dish, smile my widest smile, and I would not let Eleanor get to me. But she always did. She had an uncanny instinct for finding my weak spots and attacking them with precision. A comment about my weight, a question about whether I was feeding Finn properly, an insinuation that I wasn't spending enough time with my son, and I would sit there, smiling, pushing food around my plate, swallowing her words along with the mashed potatoes. That year, Finn had just turned 3. Old enough to run, but not old enough to understand why he shouldn't touch the glass ornaments hanging low on Eleanor's Christmas tree. Already up in late November because she liked to get ahead of the season. I spent most of the afternoon chasing him out of the dining room, away from the hot oven door, away from his grandfather's display case, which nobody else seemed to think was strange to keep at toddler height. Finn was at that stage where everything was an adventure. He didn't understand why the glass baubles on the tree weren't toys. He didn't understand why he couldn't touch the shiny knives in the case. He just wanted to explore, and I was the one who had to stop him. Over and over, while my in-laws sat watching like I was put on a show, Sawyer's brother, Cassius, sat in the living room with a beer. Watching football, occasionally glancing over like my parenting, was a form of entertainment. He had a way of smirking that made me want to throw some at his head. He and Sawyer looked alike in an unsettling way, with the same gray eyes and the same way of speaking with false authority. But Cassius was the worst version. He didn't hide his contempt. He displayed it openly like I was a servant who wasn't performing my duties properly. His wife, Isla, sat beside him, scrolling her phone, offering nothing but the occasional comment about how some kids just need more structure. Their teenage daughter, Mia, sat at a small table in the corner, staring at her phone with the indifference of adolescence. Occasionally, Mia would look up and stare at me with undisguised curiosity. I wondered what she thought of me. Probably just a tired woman. Chasing a toddler. Trying to keep things from falling apart. I said nothing. I smiled. I chased my son. I told myself again that this year would be different. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be. It would never be different. Because I had shown them I could endure. I had shown them I would stay silent. And they had taken advantage of that year after year. By the time we sat down to eat, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the cooking or the cleaning. It was the exhaustion of holding my tongue for 6 years. My jaw ached from tension, my back ached from tension, and I hadn't had a single drink, even though I'd never wanted one more. The table was laid out beautifully, white tablecloth, best china, and in the center a golden turkey that Eleanor had spent all day cooking. There was so much food you could barely see the table. The whole family gathered, 8 of us, and he sat at the end of the table, closest to the kitchen, where I could easily get up to fetch more food or drinks. I always sat there. I was never invited to sit near the head. Eleanor waited until everyone had a full plate. She always did. She liked an audience. Everly, she said. That same pleasant smile that never once reached her eyes. Are you still sending Finn to daycare? I keep telling Sawyer a little boy needs his mother, not strangers raising him. The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet when everyone already knows what's coming. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting. The silence was so heavy, I could hear my own breathing. I looked at Sawyer. I always looked at Sawyer first. Some old habit of hoping he'd finally speak up. He kept his eyes on his plate. I work because I need to, I said, keeping my voice level. And because I want to. Eleanor let out a small laugh, the kind designed to sound sympathetic while doing the opposite. Of course you do. Always put yours first. Cassius just smirked in his drink. Isla leaned toward Mia and whispered something that made the girl giggle behind her hand. Roscoe, at the head of the table, said nothing. Just cut his meat with the focus of a man trying to appear deaf, but I knew he heard. He always heard. He just never did anything. Heat crept up my neck. I felt it the way you feel a storm coming, pressure before the rain. Something inside me, some final worn-down thread. I pay half the mortgage, I said, my voice rising slightly. I pay for Finn's daycare. Last year, I paid off 4. End of Sawyer's credit card debt without a single complaint. Sawyer's fork hit his plate hard enough that the sound cut through the room. Everly, he said, a warning. Eleanor leaned forward like she'd been waiting for exactly this. There it is, always keeping score. No wonder my son looks miserable. Something inside me snapped completely. I didn't care anymore. I was outs myself, looking down. I saw a woman who had endured enough. No, I said, and my voice shook, but I didn't stop. Sawyer looks miserable because he's spent years lying to this entire family and letting me clean up after him. The room went still. So still I could hear the candle wax burning. Sawyer's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What did just say? Eleanor's voice had lost its sweetness entirely. Everly, what are you saying? I stood. My chair scraped against the hardwood loud in the sudden silence. I look around the table at every face. I saw Cassius's shock, Isla's curiosity, the panic in Sawyer's eyes, and I saw Eleanor, whose expressions had shifted from pleasure to fury. Ask him why our savings account has less than 3 in it, I said. Ask him why he borrowed 10,000 from my father 2 years ago and never paid it back. Ask him why he tells me every month that we're struggling while he's been quietly moving money into a trading account and losing most of it. Sawyer stood so fast his chair nearly tipped. That's enough. No, I said, it's not enough. I've spent 3 years letting your family blame me for problems you created. I'm done. His jaw tightened. His eyes were bloodshot. I could see him trying to contain his rage, but I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I had been afraid of him for years. Afraid to face the truth about him. Now I wasn't afraid of anything. And then, in front of his mother, his father, his brother's wife, and his niece, he said the words that end everything. Apologize or pack your things and leave. Every eye in that room turned to me. I could feel what they expected. Tears, an apology, the same surrender I'd offered 100 times before. They expected me to bow my head, to cry, to beg Sawyer for forgiveness. That's what they'd seen me do for years. But he didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, I looked past all of them toward the living room, where Finn had fallen asleep on the couch with his toy dump truck still tucked under one arm. completely unaware that his entire world was about to change, and the anger I'd been carrying just left. What replaced it wasn't sadness. It was clarity, sharp and cold and absolute certain. "Okay," I said. I untied my apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. I walked in the living room, gently lifted Finn into my arms. He stirred in his sleep, clutching his truck, and I felt his warmth against my chest. He walked to the door without looking back. "Where are you going?" Sawyer called after me. "You don't have a car. You forgot your phone." I didn't answer. The door closed behind me. Part 3. What they didn't know Sawyer stayed behind that night. He told me he needed to clear his head, which I understood even then, to mean he needed his mother to tell him he'd done the right thing. I drove home alone with Finn, asleep in his car seat, and somewhere on that dark highway I stopped crying. I stopped shaking. What took its place was a plan, not one I built that night, but one I realized driving home I had already been building for months without letting myself admit it. Because here's what I hadn't told anyone at that table. For the past 4 months, I hadn't just been suspicious of Sawyer's finances. I'd been documenting them. It started small, as divorce stories often do. A missing forward from our joint account that Sawyer explained away as a work expense reimbursement pending. Then 6 and more. Then a full paycheck that never showed up where it should have. I might have overlooked those. I had overlooked them before. But there was a difference. I had started paying attention. I'm a financial analyst. Numbers don't lie to me the way people do. So I started pulling bank statements, screenshots, transact histories. I opened a folder on my laptop labeled blandly, text documents, because I knew Sawyer would never look there. I started matching numbers, searching for patterns, and what I found made my stomach turn. Sawyer hadn't just borrowed $10,000 from my father and failed to repay it. He told my father the money was for a home repair, then used most of it for a high-risk options trading account that lost nearly 70% of its value within 3 months. He'd taken out a personal loan in both our names, a loan I never signed for, using a signature that I later confirmed. With the help of a document examiner, was forged. He'd missed 2 mortgage payments that he told me he'd handled. Catching them current only after late fees had already been quietly paid from an account I didn't know existed. That was just the tip of the iceberg. When I dug deeper, I found a complex web of financial arrangements that Sawyer had built over years. Secret bank accounts, risky investments, debts I didn't know about. I spent many nights sitting in front of my computer screen, piecing it all together, and I saw a picture of a man slowly drown in debt, pulling my family down with him, and the recordings. I want to be honest about this part because it matters. Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means it's legal to record a conversation you're a participant in without telling the other person. I had started keeping a small recorder in my bag months earlier, not out of some grand scheme, but because I'd learned that, after family dinners, Sawyer would sometimes tell me one version of events and later insist he'd said something else entirely. I wanted proof of my own reality. I want to be able to go back and hear what was actually said so I wouldn't have to doubt my own memory. He never imagined that proof would end up being the thing that changed everything. That night's dinner was on the recorder, too. Every word. Every voice, Sawyer's threats, and Eleanor's barbs. I had it all. By the time I pulled in our driveway, I wasn't a woman fleeing a bad night. I was a woman who had just been handed the final piece of evidence she needed. I packed 2 suitcases. I gathered Finn's passport, my own documents, and the emergency cash my grandmother had pressed into my hand years earlier, along with words I never forgot. Every woman should have a way out, even if she never planned to use it. My grandmother was a wise woman. She had lived through a bad marriage, and she knew. When she handed me that envelope of cash, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "You may not need it, but you'll thank me if you do." I never opened that envelope. I just put it in my safe with other important papers and forgot it was there, until that night. Then I opened my laptop and booked 2 one-way tickets to Lisbon, Portugal. I had researched this option for weeks, a city I'd visited once for a work conference and quietly fallen in love with. A country with a legal system that didn't have an extradition treaty with the U.S., a stable economy, a large expat community where I could blend in, and most importantly, a place Sawyer had 0 ties to, 0 contacts. and zero ability to reach with a passport he didn't have ready. Before we boarded, I sent one final email, not to Sawyer but to my attorney, a woman named Margot Holt, who I'd hired quietly 2 months earlier after the forged loan document surfaced. Margot was a notorious divorce lawyer in Columbus. She wasn't afraid to fight, and she wasn't afraid to play dirty if needed. Attached to that email was everything. The recording from Thanksgiving dinner, 4 months of bank statements, the forged signature analysis, the trading account records, and a fully drafted divorce petition citing financial deception and forged documents. I waited until the plane took off to send that email. I want to be in the air when everything exploded. I want to be unreachable. Part 4. The collapse. My attorney filed the petition the next morning. Within 48 hours, 3 things happened at once, and each was a crippling blow first. The bank flagged the forged personal loan for review after my attorney submitted the signature analysis, which meant Sawyer suddenly had a bank fraud investigation attached to his name. One he couldn't blame on me because I had the paperwork proving I never signed it. The bank doesn't mess around with signature forgery. They froze his accounts. They sent threatened letters. And they began internal investigation that would drag on for months and end in criminal charges. Second, my father, who had never been repaid that $10,000, received a call from my attorney's office. For the first time, he learned the truth. The money he'd handed over for a home repair had actually funded a trading account that lost most of its value in weeks. My father is a quiet man. Quiet men remember everything. I still remember the silence on the phone when I explained it to him myself before the lawyers got involved. A long pause, and then his only question, does Everly know how much of her college fund we used to help them with the down payment on their house? I hadn't known that either. It turned out Sawyer's debts had been quietly absorbing pieces of my own family's generosity for years, and nobody had thought to tell me. My father didn't file criminal charges right away, but he made it clear through his own lawyer that repayment with interest was no longer optional, and that any further understanding would end differently. He was a gentle man, but he had the patience of someone who had waited a long time. And he was out of patience third, and this is the part that made phones start ringing across an entire family tree. I sent Eleanor a single email. Not angry, not dramatic, just factual, with the Thanksgiving recording attached along with a note that read, "You asked why Sawyer looks miserable. Now you know." I had thought long and hard about that email. Part of me wanted to write a long letter, detailing everything I'd been through. Another part wanted to just send the recording and say nothing else. In the end, I took the middle path. I want her to know that I had heard everything. I want her to know that I had proof, and I want her to live with that truth. Eleanor called me 1 times in 1 hour. I was somewhere over international waters for most of them, phone in airplane mode. Son asleep against my shoulder, utterly unaware that his father's carefully built version of reality was collapsing in real time. I didn't answer any of those calls. I didn't need to. I had said what I need to say. Part 5. The unexpected discovery. Here's where the story takes a turn I didn't see coming, even after everything. 2 weeks after we landed in Lisbon, my attorney called with an update. I thought everything was over. I thought I had it all, but I was wrong. In reviewing the forged loan documents as part of the fraud investigation, the bank's internal team had flagged something unusual. A pattern of small, structured transfers moving out of Sawyer's personal trading account and into an account belonging to his father, Roscoe. At first, I assumed it was simple financial support, a father helping a struggling son. But the transfers had started nearly 2 years earlier, long before Sawyer's trading losses began. When my attorney dug further, working with a forensic accountant, a different picture emerged. Roscoe hadn't just been receiving money from Sawyer. He'd been the one who originally introduced Sawyer to the high-risk trading platform. And he'd been quietly steering a portion of both their retirement savings into it for over 3 years. Money that, according to Eleanor's own later statements to my attorney during a deposition, she had no idea existed. The family home Eleanor was so proud of had a second mortgage on it that Sawyer's father had taken out without her knowledge, using some of that money to cover trading losses that had nearly wiped out what Sawyer and Roscoe both owed. That was the moment I understood the full truth. The man with the display case full of polished antiques. The patriarch who sat at the head of every Thanksgiving table judging my choices, the man who had looked at me with contempt for years, had spent years hiding financial decisions from his own wife, decisions that eventually pulled his son into the same pattern of secrecy and debt. Eleanor, the woman who once told me a good wife should never question her husband's decisions, found out at 61 years old that she'd been living that exact life without knowing it. I won't pretend I felt sympathy in that moment. I felt something closer to recognition. The family that spent 3 years telling me I wasn't good enough had been quietly falling apart from the inside. It took an outsider, the woman they never accepted, to force the truth in daylight. I sat there, in my small apartment in Lisbon, looking out at the terracotta rooftops, and I laughed. Not a triumphant laugh, but a laugh of relief. I hadn't been crazy. I hadn't imagined it all. The truth was there, and it was bigger than I had ever imagined. Part 6. The aftermath. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Ohio courts don't move quickly, but forged financial documents have a way of speeding things along once a judge sees them. Sawyer couldn't fight the charges. He had signed my name on a loan document. He had taken money from my father. He had lied about our finance for years. The judge saw it all, and the judge was not impressed. Sawyer was ordered to repay my father in full with interest over a 3-year structured payment plan enforced by the court. A forged loan was voided entirely, and the bank pursued its own investigation separate, resulting in Sawyer facing formal fraud charges tied to the falsified signature. Charges that, as of the last update from my attorney, were still moving through the system. He wouldn't go to prison, at least not immediately. But he would carry that charge with him, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. I was awarded full custody of Finn with supervised limited visitation for Sawyer pending the outcome of his legal situation. The court reviewed the Thanksgiving recording as part of the broader pattern of financial control and deception, and while it wasn't a deciding factor legally, my attorney told me privately that it painted a picture the judge didn't forget. It showed a man willing to humiliate his wife in front of his family. It showed a family willing to enable that behavior. And it showed me, finally, standing up. I never spoke to Eleanor again after that email. I heard secondhand through a cousin who still checks in occasionally that she and Roscoe separated within the year, unable to recover from the discovery that their entire financial life had been built on decisions made behind each other's backs. Eleanor had spent 40 years with a man she thought she understood, only to discover that he had been deceiving her as much as Sawyer had deceived me. I can't say I felt sorry for her, but I understood that pain. I had lived with it long enough. Cassius and Ela, for their part, went quiet. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence. The same silence I'd offered them for 3 years finally returned. They never called. They never wrote. It just vanished from my life as if I had never existed. I heard months later that Isla had quietly reached out to a mutual friend asking how I'd managed the move overseas so quickly, as though she, too, had been keeping a version of that plan tucked away somewhere waiting for a reason brave enough to use it. I don't know what she did with that information. I don't care. Part 7. A new life is for me. I stayed in Lisbon longer than I originally planned. Finn started at a small international with an preschool built round a courtyard, and within a few months he was saying Brigado more naturally than he Gado more naturally than he said his own last name. He loved school, he loved his new friends, and he started calling Lisbon home. I kept my job remotely for the first year, waking up early to match Ohio hours, working from a small kitchen table with a view of terracotta rooftops instead of a cul-de-sac in Columbus. It wasn't a luxurious life. My apartment was small, and I often missed the conveniences of my old life, but I didn't miss Sawyer. I didn't miss his family. I didn't miss the silence eventually. I transitioned to a position with a firm that let me build a life on my own terms in a city that never once made me feel like I had to shrink myself to be accepted at a dinner table. I started working for an international finance company, using my skills to help small business manage their finance. I loved the work. I loved the feeling of helping people who were struggling to keep their numbers straight, because I knew what that felt like. There's a particular kind of quiet I found there that I hadn't known I was missing. Not the tense, holding your breath quiet of Eleanor's dining room, but an easy quiet, Finn asleep down the hall. No one waiting for me to say the wrong thing so they could pounce on it. Just the sound of a city that didn't know or care about the woman I used to be at that Thanksgiving table and had no interest in making me smaller than I was. I started writing. At first, it was just a journal, my thoughts about what had happened. But then it became something more. I wrote about silence and what I had learned from it. I wrote about the courage it takes to break it. And I wrote about other women. Women who were living in their own silences, waiting for a reason to speak. I received many emails from women who read my story. Some said they had been in similar relationships. Some said my story had given them the courage to leave. Others said they were making plans. Those emails made me cry, but they also made me smile. I hadn't broken the silence just for mice. I had broken it for all those who were living in it. Part 8. The conclusion I think about that Thanksgiving table sometimes. The chandelier too big for the room, the display case no be questioned, the silence I mistook for peace for far too long. Think about the exact moment Soichar told me to apologize or leave, genuinely believing I'd choose the first option because I always had before. He was wrong, and that single miscalculation cost him everything he thought he'd protected by staying quiet for all those years. Looking back, I don't think Sawyer ever understood what he was actually asking me to do that night. He thought he was giving me an ultimatum. What he was really doing was giving me permission. Permission to stop performing a version of mice that had never once been protected in return. Permission to see the truth. Permission to leave. Some people spend years building a life on secrets, assuming the people around them will always choose comfort over truth. Sawyer's family certainly assumed that of me. They were wrong, and it cost them a marriage, a fortune, and a family that will likely never sit around that same table again. I don't regret the years I gave that family because they taught me exactly what I would no longer accept. They taught me how to spot a lie, how to read a man who was hiding something, and how to stand up for mice when no one else would. I don't regret the moment I chose silence over an apology. I didn't because that silence was the loudest thing I ever said. I have learned that there are many kinds of silence. There is the silence of fear, the silence of complicity, the silence of someone who has given up, and there is the silence of someone who is listening, watching, waiting. That is kind of silence I chose in those final years of my marriage. I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was preparing. Now, when I look back, I see clearly that the moment they thought they had won was actually the moment they lost. When Sawyer said, apologize or leave, he thought he was controlling me, but he gave me everything I needed, a reason, an opportunity, a liberation. So here's my question for you. If the people who were supposed to protect you asked you to apologize for a truth they didn't want to hear, would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have already been packing your bags? And if you choose to leave, remember this: you are not just leaving them. You are coming to yourself, and there is no journey more worth taking.